I have some interesting information. So we're going to talk about the reality of Black marriages in the 1900s. So something that we often hear is that our grandmothers were good women. They stayed in their marriages. They didn't get divorced, and they were better women because they kept the families together. But what was the reality of Black marriages back then? Okay, I'm just going to read the highlighted parts. If you want to go back and read the whole thing, this is from the book The Negro Family in the United States by Franklin Frazier. Um, and Franklin Frazier was a Black male with a doctorate in sociology. And he put together this information. The book that I have is a condensed version, but the original has way more information. It has graphs and all of that. So you can look for the original, or you can get the condensed version. So this is from the chapter Divorce, Script from the Law. So what is this saying? Okay. In nearly all of the states where the colored population is very dense, nearly, if not quite, three-fourths of the divorces granted were to colored people. Likewise, the census report 20 years later stated that statements of court officials and of divorce lawyers in those sections of the South where the Negro constitutes a considerable element of the population tend to show that divorces granted to colored persons form from 50 to as high as 90% of all divorces. So we have been told that, Black people were the most married back then, they stayed together and all that. In my previous videos, Franklin Frazier pointed out that even though Black women were married, they were the most deserted women. They were being abandoned more than any race of women. And so this just kind of capitalizes on what Franklin Frazier already talked about. Yes, at some point in history, Black women were more married, but they were also the most abandoned race of women out of all races of women in America back then. So let's continue with the highlighted parts. The states having the highest percentage of Negro population, and in both divisions, and in all the states without exception, the ratio of divorces to population was greater, and in several instances, much greater for the colored than for the white. Okay. I'll just start here. This comparison failed to show any relation between these two phenomena. Actually, the four states with the lowest percentage of Negroes, West Virginia, Kentucky, Oklahoma, and Texas, had the highest divorce rates. And let's go down here. Professor Wilcox's carefully worded conclusion that on the whole, it seems probable that the average Negro divorce rate is rather below that of the Southern whites, but is increasing much more rapidly. And in a few localities or states may have already reached or passed it, was probably true. So at one point, and this was 1897. Remember, Black people were freed in 1863. And Franklin Frazier talks about how when Black men were emancipated, they began abandoning their wives and children. Not all of them, but some. A large percent did, but some stayed. And so this is basically building onto that. The divorce rate skyrocketed, and Black women were abandoned to raise children alone at alarming rates. Okay, let's continue. For the years 1928 through 1930, there were 8.4 divorces per 100 marriages among Negroes. Whereas during this same time period, the rate for whites increased from 12.3 to 13.7%. So At some point, whites had a higher divorce rate than blacks, but then at some point, black divorces surpassed even that of white people. Okay, let's continue. I'm gonna start here. The unstable family and marital relations of the Negro in the city, together with his fear of punishment in case of forming bigamous relations, provide a partial explanation of the discovery by Professor Ogborn that Negroes, on the basis of an analysis of the 1920 census for 5 states, sought divorces more frequently than whites. The 1910 census indicated that in a third to 2/5 of the Negro families in some southern cities, the husband or wife or both had been married more than once. So they had been divorced at one point, remarried. Between 1920 and 1930, in practically every city with 10,000 or more Negroes, there was an increase in the percentage of divorced persons in the Negro population. Let's read that again. Between 1920, because we've been told that the 1960s is what started to destroy Black families, but Franklin Frazier has pointed out that no, Black families were being destroyed because Black men were abandoning those families as early as 1863, as soon as they were able to be free. So let's continue. Between 1920 and 1930, in practically every city with 10,000 or more Negroes, there was an increase in the percentage of divorced persons in the Negro population. A study of divorce in the county in which one of these cities, Omaha, Nebraska, is located revealed that 89 or 8% of the 922 cases of divorce were colored, although Negroes comprise only 5.3% of the population. That's interesting because something Franklin Frazier mentioned in his book was that when it came to family desertion, meaning men running off and abandoning their families, when Black people constituted a small percentage of the population, they had the highest divorce. The women had the highest abandonment rates and the high divorce rates that were surpassing even that of whites. Okay. The outstanding case of divorce among Negroes in all these cities was desertion. Now, we all remember desertion is when a man runs out on his responsibility. He runs out and abandons his family. So the outstanding cause of divorce among Negroes in all these cities was desertion. And a content creator that I watch, Sinji, she often calls it the poor man's divorce. So what would happen is the men, like they had been doing since they gained freedom, were running off, abandoning their wives. And so that gave the wife grounds for divorce, because if she can't find out where her husband is, he's not coming home, she can go file a divorce and it be granted. So let's start over. The outstanding cause of divorce among Negroes in all these cities was desertion, whereas among the whites, adultery was given as the cause in about 1/4 to 1/2 as many cases as desertion among the Negroes. Adultery figured as the cause in only from a 12th to 1/10 as many cases as desertion. So plain and simple, the men were abandoning their wives at alarming rates. White people were staying married or they were getting divorced because of adultery, not because the man ran off and abandoned his family. That was something that was common among Black men. Of this number, 24 were granted for desertion. So 24 divorces were granted for desertion. This was in 1930. So I'll just read this. For example, in Newport News, in 1930, there were 29 divorces granted to Negroes. Of this number, 24 were granted for desertion. Wow. So that means out of the 29 divorces, out of the 29 divorces, 24 of those women had been abandoned by their husbands. This is a phenomenon that was common with Negro men and women. The women weren't running off abandoning their families, the men were. But this has been happening since emancipation. The men choosing to run out and abandon their families. Oh, let me go back. No. Okay, so let me read this. It is also significant that divorces for desertion are granted to Negro men in almost the same proportion of cases as Negro women. So, although desertion refers to the legal cause and not the real cause of divorce, from what we know of Negro family life in the urban environment, it probably describes fairly accurately the real nature of the break in conjugal relations that leads to divorce. So when it says divorces for desertion are granted to Negro men in almost the same proportion of cases as Negro women, it's going to explain what that actually means. Okay, when the Negro woman gives desertion as the cause, she is probably describing the real situation in a large majority of cases. But the Negro man, who has often deserted, i.e., abandoned his wife, will give desertion as the cause because it is accepted as a legal cause, and his wife may have no knowledge of what is occurring. So, again, what these men would do is often referred to as the poor man's divorce. They would just get up, run off, and abandon their families. What this is talking about is that when the men would go and file and claim to be deserted, they were the ones who had abandoned their wives and children. But they knew that desertion gave couples a grounds to get a divorce. So they would often pretend like they were deserted when they were the ones who were running away from their families. In some cases, the man, who is generally more sophisticated in the ways of the city than a woman, may get a divorce without his wife understanding what is happening. This was the case with a young woman from New Orleans who appeared before the Court of Domestic Relations in Chicago in order to find out if she had been legally married and, if so, whether her husband could divorce her without her consent. So this is a woman who wanted to stay married. She wanted her man in the house. She wanted her husband. The husband didn't feel the same. So her suspicion had been aroused by her neighbors, whom she had informed that she had received a summons concerning a divorce with which her husband had. Listen to this. Her husband tore up the paper and said there was nothing to it. Basically, he gaslit her, made her think everything was okay. He ripped up the paper so she couldn't read it. Little did she know he was divorcing her behind her back. So it says, as it turned out, the woman had been legally married, and her husband, taking advantage of her ignorance, was getting a divorce in order to marry another woman. So here's a man who was divorcing his wife without her knowledge so that he could marry someone else that he was probably cheating on her with, probably lusting after. And this woman wanted her family. She didn't want to be divorced, but her husband didn't want to be married to her anymore. And the way he went about it was very cruel and heartless. To go behind her back, file for a divorce. When the papers come to her, you gaslight her and tell her, oh, it's nothing to be worried about. And come to find out, you divorced her behind her back. In some cases where a man is a drunkard and abuses his wife or fails to support his family, the woman who has to support the family may get a divorce in order to free herself and children from this interference in the family. So, if you go back and study actual history and not just take somebody's word for it when they're telling you Black women destroyed the Black family and telling you that our grandmother stayed married and all this stuff they're telling us because it benefits them and it absolves them from their responsibility of historically abandoning their women and children. When you go and read history, you see that Black women wanted their husbands home. Black women didn't want to be divorced. And in the event that Black women did get divorced, it was because the husband was abusive, or like the story we just read, he was a drunk and he served no purpose. He was useless. He wasn't needed in a home because all he did was brought headache and drama, didn't provide anything. So the women would get fed up and they would put them out, as they should have. Okay. Concerning the reason she divorced her husband, she stated simply, he was too darn mean to me. He was just a drunkard. When he had money, he wouldn't help the children. Doesn't this sound like that story of the man who were getting food stamps behind his wife's back? Yeah. When he had money, he wouldn't help the children. It was up to me to care for them. Basically, she was doing everything on her own. So what purpose did he serve? Why not put him out? After the divorce, I just stayed here and worked for my children. Now let's go here. A woman in Chicago remarked that she finally surrendered and gave her husband a divorce after he had deserted her 4 times and had taken up his abode with another woman. So this is a different story. And this is a woman talking about her divorce. Why she got divorced is because her husband was constantly running off on her, abandoning her, and he eventually got with another woman while he was married to her. And so she had to submit to divorcing him. She wanted to stay married to her husband, but he didn't want to be married to her. So she submitted to that and filed for divorce. So far, none of these stories sound like Black women wanted Black men out the house who were serving a purpose. Sounds like 1, they wanted their husbands. 2, they wanted husbands that contributed to the family in a healthy way. But our grandmothers stayed and their marriages lasted, right? This is another story. And so what would happen, why they have these stories in there, when they would go to the family court or to go get assistance, which they were doing in the early 1900s, they would have to write out what happened. And so the people who were writing these reports down, they kept records of everything. And so this is one of the stories. This is a daughter describing her mother's marriage to her dad. Up to that time, I thought that love between man and woman was very sacred and that the few fusses mother and dad had around home were just thrown in with the pleasant things to keep marriage from growing monotonous. I thought that if 2 people ever loved each other, my mother and father did. The last year they were together made me realize it was not all roses. But the final divorce sterilely disillusioned me. I knew that the only thing my mother did was to quarrel with dad, but my father had been untrue. Naturally, I sympathized with my mother more than with dad. I began to believe all men were the same way. I felt that if after all the years my mother and father had been living together, he could do as he had done, no man would ever mean anything to me. Our friends say that the affair has made me sensitive. That is true. So this woman was married to this man, and he started stepping out on her, which caused her to quarrel with him. It caused them to not get along. It caused them to argue a lot. And that makes sense. He had a wife, and he was stepping out on his wife. And so, yeah, any woman who's been cheated on by her husband is going to have issue with that. And she is going to fight with her husband. And ultimately, it does end in divorce. Not all the time, but sometimes it does. So why did our grandmothers stay? Well, 1, they stayed for the children. They thought that staying in unhappy marriages was helping the children, but it was actually damaging the children. They stayed to avoid embarrassment. Sometimes they stayed because the husband was the one with the money. So they had no choice. This is a, oh yeah. So this is emphasizing again why couples in unhappy marriages stay together. It says they prefer to suffer conjugal infelicity rather than to air their disagreements in the divorce courts or acknowledge their marital failures before the Negro world. So they cared more about what other Black people might think if they got a divorce because they weren't happy with each other. So they basically just chose to suffer in silence. But our grandmother stayed and their marriages lasted. A lot of the staying in bad marriages was about pride. Nobody wanted to admit that their marriages had failed. So many of the women and men stayed married and unhappy. A lot of our grandmothers were being abused, cheated on, abandoned, and stressed to hell out in order to avoid the condemnation of the community. Black women stayed in unhappy marriages. So Black women have been sacrificing themselves since forever. But our grandmothers stayed and their marriages lasted. How did our grandmothers staying in bad marriages affect the children? So this is a snippet from a different book. The book is a Black Demographic. And this is a teenage girl describing her father finally being gone. So one high school girl cited an instance where a husband finally wandered off after several years of internecine strife. My mother and father have been separated for 2 years. I don't miss my father at all. He was so unpleasant that I was glad to see him leave. He gambled and drank and didn't provide for the family. We had to go on relief assistance. And this book was published in 1945, by the way. So we had to go on relief because of the way he acted. So I hope I never see him again. He abused mother too. My mother has had a very hard life. She married young and he started mistreating her right after I was born. I'm the oldest, and he made her life so miserable that she had to leave him any number of times. But she always went back on account of us. So this woman constantly going back to her husband because she wanted him to be in the kids' lives. It was actually affecting the kids to the point that this girl, the way she's talking, she don't even like her dad. He was a horrible person, and they had to get assistance from the county because their dad wasn't doing anything. He wasn't providing anything. He was unstable. He was just unpleasant. And this is the early 1900s. They were getting assistance from the county agents in the early 1900s, not the 60s like we're being told. What can we conclude from this information? Black marriage is the same as it was in the 1900s. Well, less marriages, but the relationships are basically the same. The only difference is that women are allowing Black men to reap the benefits of marriage without having to actually marry them, which makes it easier for the men to run away from their responsibility. Our grandmothers were not all happy, and they tortured themselves by staying in unhappy marriages and keeping their heads down and their mouths shut because they cared too much about what people would think if they were to divorce. Can you imagine a bunch of women all suffering in their marriages, but they don't realize that they're all going through the same thing because they were taught to keep it in house and to never talk about it? Silence has historically been the killer of Black women. When we're sexually abused, we're told to keep quiet. When we're physically abused, we're told to keep quiet. When we're verbally abused, we're told to be quiet. And we're told to be quiet in order for the community to protect the abusers in the community. When our lives are in danger, we're told to be quiet. Least the men trying to harm us be harmed in the process of harming us. Black women staying in unhappy marriages because they were too afraid of what people might say or think if they did what was best for them was never good for Black women. We are not our grandmothers.